All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of the D&D Deep Dive, the show where we dive deep into cookie classes, subclasses, and other features of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons to help you get the most out of your choices. So, today, we are going to be continuing along the path of the warrior by looking at the Beast of Defiance warrior. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this stuff, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon and turn notifications on. All of those are really important to let me know you like this, and they let Google know that they should let other people see it. So yeah. Previously, we talked about the warrior, which the base version of the warrior falls into a similar trap that we've seen other ones, where it basically takes defining features of other classes and puts them in this one, and then tries to create a new class using the foundation of the old class, and it just doesn't really work. Basically, it's kind of like trying to make a subclass, but having too many abilities for a subclass. You turn it into a full class with some of the things, and balance-wise, it just doesn't work because the original class was designed around those defining features. That's how 5th edition works, is all the classes are defined around these defining features. That's why we call them defining features. And if you start taking them away and adding new things, you start coming up with issues because everything in the old class was designed to gel with this, and everything in the new one is different and adds new systems that don't gel and reinforce the defining features, and it turns into a mess. And that's basically what the warrior was. The warrior was basically a barbarian with some kind of interesting abilities, but their version of rage was extremely neutered. To the point where really the only useful aspect of their rage thing, which was called Berserk, was it let them use other abilities that were a little bit more useful. But for the most part, it just wasn't that useful. So I made some suggestions. Really, only one like major suggestion, and then some modifications to make things work with it, which was change Berserk into Defiance and basically take a little bit of inspiration from 4th edition and add a marking mechanic. And that changed the whole feeling of the class. And I didn't really have to make a ton of other changes. It was just that one big shift, getting rid of the barbarian abilities that they'd put in there because the class didn't need it. It's not a barbarian, and turning it into something kind of cool. So, the subclasses, we're going to see how they work. So, quick reminder, in 5th edition class design, every class in 5th edition D&D is designed to play very differently right from the beginning. In order to do that, they have these things called defining features. These are abilities that are either unique to the class, or they may not be unique, but the class gets them earlier than other classes, or can use them in a different way than other classes. The old defining features were Berserk and Reckless Attack, which are barbarian defining features, so we don't need to worry about them. The new defining feature is a thing called Defiance. Effectively, you use a bonus action to enter Defiance, very similar to Berserk, but what Defiance does is anytime you make a melee weapon attack against an enemy, you can mark them. Marking is something that used to happen in 4th edition. It was actually kind of fun and interesting. It was a cool way to play your tank kind of characters. They were called defenders back then. And basically, when a creature is marked, if it makes an attack that doesn't include you, in that attack, they're going to make it with disadvantage. And if they cast a spell or use an ability that doesn't target you, doesn't have you at least included in the targeting, any creature that has to make a saving throw against that is going to make that saving throw with advantage. So, overall, the marking mechanic in 4th edition was designed to give monsters a reason to focus on the defenders. And that's really what we kind of rebuilt the warrior around, is this idea of the warrior is going to be someone that works on basically getting enemies to attack the warrior instead of their allies. So yes, let's actually get into the Beast of Defiance. Now, the Beast of Defiance in the description, they kind of played off as, or they describe the Beast of Defiance as effectively the defensive version of the class. Their kind of focus is on protecting their allies. So to make this easier, I'm going to go through the full subclass just as it's written, and then during final thoughts, I'm going to make my suggestions for what I would do differently to make it work with the new version of the warrior. So yeah, let's dive into it. At 3rd level, you get Disruption. Being at 3rd level, while you're under the effects of Berserk, when a creature you can see attacks a target other than you that is within 5 feet of you, you can use your reaction to impose disadvantage on the attack roll. If anyone thinks that sounds familiar, that's because that's the protection fighting style. The only difference is this one requires you to be in Berserk, and protection requires you to wear a shield. That's the only difference, but the text is identical. Yeah, this 3rd level ability has basically given them a fighting style. Which isn't the worst idea in the world, except for the fact that warriors already get fighting styles. So they could have had that, if they wanted that to be a part of the kit, they could have had that in the fighting style already. And linking it to Berserk, again, doesn't really help it just makes it significantly more limited than even the protection fighting style, which is already a somewhat limited fighting style, because not only does it require you to wield a shield, which if you are playing your kind of sword and board kind of defender character, wielding a shield is not that big a setback. But it also requires you to be right next to someone when they get attacked. So it not only requires planning from the warrior, whoever the person is using protection or disruption in this case, but it also requires the rest of the party to understand, oh, I need to end my turn right next to the warrior so that he might be able to help me out later. The other thing with protection is the further on the higher level you get, where creatures start getting multi-attack, the less useful protection becomes, simply because it requires your reactions. You can only use it once per round, effectively. And for creatures that get multi-attack, their damage comes from hitting multiple times, not so much from one strong hit. Now, there are some monsters that do have these one really big, massive hits, even with multi-attack. In the game I ran on Wednesday, the creature they were fighting had a bite attack and then a claw attack. And their multi-attack feature let them bite once and claw twice. Well, the bite did 30 damage, while each of the claws only did 18. So theoretically, the claws could do more damage, but they would do it in multiple attacks, whereas the bite was the big one that hurt, and also because it was one thing of damage for any character that was concentrating on something, the claws were significantly better for them, because the DC for the concentration check from a claw attack was only 10, whereas the DC for a concentration check from the bite attack was 15. So, so theoretically, in situations where a creature has a really strong attack and then some not as strong attacks, disruption or protection fighting style can be useful, but it requires the warrior to really understand the enemies really well to know which one of their multi-attacks you want to block. And it also puts a little bit more weight on the DM, because I myself have done this depending on how combat was running, and I've seen a lot of DMs do this. When they deal with multi-attack, even if it's different kinds of attack, they'll just go, okay, he's going to attack you 3 times. So shoot, shoot, shoot. He rolls the 3 attacks. He goes, okay, the 3 attack rolls are 17, 18, and 14. Do those hit? And they'll go, okay, so you take a total of this much. That is a remarkably common DMing style. It does speed up combat a fair amount. Which, when you have larger parties, that can be a godsend. Combat can become very, very muddy and slow. If you have like 5 and 6 person parties, or if you get up to a 7 person party, combat can seem monotonous at times. So that is a viable thing. But if a DM is running things like that, disruption becomes significantly more difficult to figure out when to use, because they're just going to go, okay, I'm going to roll 3 attacks, and then you kind of have to guess, okay, does one of you either have to interrupt and goes, okay, does one of those attacks do more damage than the other ones? And depending on the DM, they might go, well, you don't know that. Okay, well then, is one of them look different? Is one of them a bite versus a claw or something? Like, it can turn into an argument at the table, because in order to get the most use out of disruption, you need to know what the most damaging attack is. Because if you put disadvantage on one of the claw attacks from the creature I described before, one of the claw attacks instead of the bite attack, you may prevent them from taking 18 damage, but they will still take 30 damage. And if that causes them to lose concentration on something like the fly spell that they were concentrating on and levitating half the party with 80 feet in the air, then yeah, that would cause some issues. So yeah, overall, I'm not a huge fan of disruption. When we go through final thoughts, I completely rework it, because it's just, with the new version of Defiance, it just doesn't work. So yeah. Going to 6th level, you get Storm's Path. When you successfully land a melee weapon attack while under the effects of Berserk, you may declare you are using Storm's Path. The target creature makes a strength saving throw against your Berserk DC. On a failed save, the creature deals 1d6 less damage on their damage rolls for a number of rounds equal to your strength modifier. This damage reduction is increased to 2d6 at 14th level. You may only use Storm's Path once during each use of Berserk. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack from this. First things first, it's overly complicated for what it does. When you hit them, you can make them roll a strength save to do less damage. That's really all it does. However, combining it with... and you have to be under Berserk. So you have to be under Berserk. They have to make a strength saving throw. It has to be against your Berserk DC. The number of turns it will affect them for changes based on your strength modifier. And the damage is a die-based damage reduction. And you can only use it once each time you Berserk. So it won't end your Berserk like some of the other abilities do. But basically, Storm's Path is a one and done ability per combat, because you're almost never going to be using Berserk more than once, because it lasts for a minute. Unless you use one of the abilities that ends Berserk, and then you might get another Storm's Path. So it adds a little bit more... planning into the class, but for the most part, it's needlessly complicated, to be blunt. The best way to use it is, again, anyone that makes multiple damage rolls is going to be the most useful. At 6th level, reducing attack by a d6 is not game changing, but it's not horrible. When it does turn into something that's a really, really big deal, is when it turns into something that you've used against a creature for multi-attack, and then it lasts for multiple turns. that turns it into something very, very interesting and fun. Simply because at 6th level, you're probably going to be dealing with creatures that have normally just 2 attacks. As you get up to 7th and 8th level and get closer to to the tier 3, you're going to start dealing with creatures that have 3 attacks. You might deal with 1 or 2 creatures that have 4 attacks for really tough fights. When you're going from in a turn, you can reduce their damage by 1d6 to in a turn, you can reduce their damage by 4d6. That is a massive amount. And then when you get to 14th level and it increases to 2d6, that's even better. Because again, by then you are dealing with creatures on the regular that have 3 and 4 attacks. So you're reducing their damage in a turn for 3d6 or 4d6 to the damage. That is a significant amount. Even at 20th level, when you have lots of hit points and the things like that. Now, where it's not as useful is when you're dealing with creatures that only do 1 attack, or spellcasters and things like that. Storm's Path will be almost useless against spell casters, simply because most spellcasters, their spells are going to do a lot more damage than attacks, and so a single d6 is not going to put a dent in like a fireball. Now, the one thing that would be useful is it's not going to put a dent in a fireball for a single target, but when you count on the fact that a fireball affects multiple to the targets, that means the more targets it hits, the more the damage is reduced as a whole against the party. And that's something that, as you get further and further along in 5th edition D&D, you have to start thinking of party hit points versus player hit points as far as what is the best use of your abilities. And that goes the same thing for the enemy party as well. If you can do, 46 damage to a single target, or 2d6 damage to 5 targets, well, the 2d6 damage feels a lot worse because it's maximum of 12 damage compared to a maximum of 24 damage. But if you spread it out amongst a lot of creatures, you're doing in total a lot more damage, and you can get more creatures killed eventually. Now, there's additional strategy in that, and the idea of, okay, well, is it better to focus fire so they have less damage coming at us and less actions, or is it better to try and kill them all at once? That's something that you have to kind of figure out with your party, because each party's makeup will be different, and some parties will be better at focus firing, and some will be better at just doing widespread damage and then picking off the stragglers. Again, it's your playstyle and your party's playstyle. But for Storm's Path, the 2 targets that you would want to make sure you're using Storm's Path on are going to be either creatures that deal multiple attacks or creatures that do area damage, because those are the ones that are going to give you the most bang for your buck for Storm's Path. Again, when we go to final thoughts, I will talk about my ideas to modify it a little bit, get rid of a little bit of the complexity that doesn't really need to be there. The only 1 use effectively per Berserk is an extremely limiting factor that I'm not particularly fond of. But I would almost rather see it end Berserk instead of being able to only be used once per Berserk, because then feeling wise it would feel a little bit better, because then you don't have to try and use another ability next turn to be able to use this on a different creature or something like that. So anyway, so that's Storm's Path. At 10th level, you get Voice of the Beast. You learn the Charm Monster and Beast Sense spells and may cast each one once. Strength is your spellcasting ability for these spells, which is interesting to say the least. You may only cast Charm Monster on beasts. You can do this once. You must then finish a long rest to use Voice of the Beast again. So the only issue I really have with this is the sentence, you can do this once. Can you use Voice of the Beast once, or can you cast each spell once? That would be something I would want to see defined. From how it's written, I would interpret it as you can either use Charm Monster or Beast Sense. Based on that. But when you go up further, it says, and may cast each one once. Those two, they kind of conflict with each other, and you can do this once. Since they've already said you may cast each one once, you don't really need that additional one. It adds some confusion to it. Because again, if I read that and missed the may cast each one once, I would read it as you can cast either Charm Monsters or Beast Spell once. You don't get to cast both of them. So I would say just remove that sentence. Otherwise, it's a cool ability. I like it. I think it's cool. Finally, at 14th level, you get Inner Beast. As an action, you can use Inner Beast. Make a melee weapon attack against a target creature. On a successful attack roll, you deal your normal weapon as well as recover hit points equal to 2d8 plus 6 hit points and deal equal bonus damage. The effect of Berserk ends immediately after you use Inner Beast. So this is an interesting ability that is really poorly worded. They have abilities like this already in D&D, and so the easy way to change this around into something that will work is you can say when you hit, you deal an additional 2d8 plus 6, pick a damage type. If you don't want to worry about resistances and stuff, just call it force damage. Literally almost nothing has resistance to force damage. Just call it force damage. It makes sense with how forceful the Defiance or the warrior is in general. So just call it force damage. So you would say on a hit, you deal an additional 2d8 plus 6 force damage and heal hit points equal to the amount of force damage dealt. That's all you have to do. You don't have to... The way it's worded here is really, really confusing. And again, I've mentioned this before. Anytime there's already an effect that exists in 5th edition D&D, if you want that same effect but you word it differently, people are going to assume you didn't want that effect, and they are going to purposefully find a different way to read it if they can, because the thought process is, if you just wanted that effect, why didn't you use that text? If there's a change in text, there has to be a reason behind it. Your word choice is very, very important in 5th edition, and in game design in general. Your word choice is very, very important. So when you choose to use very, very different wording from an already established thing, the assumption is the reason you're doing that is this works differently than that other ability, and we need to interpret it that way. And for what I get from this, and what I think is meant here, it's not. It's supposed to work just like every one of other these abilities. You see it a lot in monster stat blocks, where they get to heal for additional damage. Generally, it's necrotic damage that does it, too. So it'll be like you do an additional, 2d6 necrotic damage. And you heal for the amount of necrotic damage dealt. Things like that. So that would be... I don't have any problems with this. I think it's a really cool ability. By 14th level, you have enough uses of Berserk that it makes sense to have something that ends it. So you can basically use it as a way to burn up Berserks effectively. It's cool to have additional damage and things like that. The one kind of limiting factor of this is an action, meaning you have to give up your extra attack, which for this version is not really that big a deal, simply because it's kind of built differently. No, even then, because you get additional damage from Berserk and stuff like that, just like Rage. So yeah, so this replaces two different attacks by giving you an additional 2d8 plus 6 to the damage, and you get a weak heal. 2d8 plus 6 is not a great heal. That's effectively just slightly higher than a greater potion of healing, which by 14th level is not that great. And for a creature with a d12 as their hit die, this is probably going to heal back maybe one weak attack. So the healing is not that useful for it. The nice thing about it is if you crit with it, because you do additional damage that are part dice, you would double the dice. So that would give you double the amount of healing. Which at that point, 48 plus 6 healing is a nice chunk. But because you have to use this as an action, you're making a pretty big investment in this just to get a kind of a weak heal and hope that you get a crit. So it's actually a meaningful heal. But yeah, so that's the class itself. So final thoughts. Not a huge fan of this subclass as it's written. Again, Disruption is just the protection fighting style with some other things added to it to make it significantly less useful. So Disruption kind of fits in the same category as Berserk, where it is a lesser version of an ability that already exists and this character could have without too much difficulty. You know, Rage is a first level barbarian ability. If they multi-classed one level into barbarian, their Rage would be significantly more useful than Berserk. The only thing that would make Berserk better is it gets stronger over time as Rage does, but that's it. And then for Disruption, they can get the protection fighting style. They have proficiency in shields. There's a feat that will give you a fighting style. So taking a feat would give you a better version of Disruption, which in general, the first ability you get in your subclass should kind of point out what the subclass is about. And Disruption is just very rarely going to be used for this particular barbarian. Again, this warrior. This warrior is built a little bit more to be a damage dealer than it is to be defensive, and so it's going to be wandering off on its own and you know, going and attacking the things. And because Berserk gets most of its damage reduction against creatures that make multi-attacks, it's not going to want people to attack its allies ever. It's always going to want it focusing on them. So yeah, Disruption's not all that great. Storm's Path is interesting, but too complicated and too limited. Boys the Beast is awesome, and Inner Beast is worded poorly, and could use some balancing tweaks. But other than that, like, it's a meh for me. The third level ability is boring. The sixth level ability is interesting, but a little bit too complicated. And then the 10th and 14th level abilities are fine. But most D&D games end before 14th level, so you're never going to be able to get to use the ability that's actually cool from this. So the rework. My suggestions. Starting with Disruption. Effectively, I want to get rid of Disruption as is written, and I want to basically take what Storm's Path describes and put it into Disruption. So this is my suggestion. We're going to change the text of Disruption to read, while in Defiance, when you mark a target, you can choose to use a Disruption mark instead of the regular effect. Whenever a target with a Disruption mark rolls damage against you or one of your allies, roll a d6 and subtract that number from the damage of that damage roll. The mark fades at the start of your next turn. At 14th level, roll 2d6 instead of 1d6. So this changes Disruption from just an extra ability you get that you're not going to use much to something that modifies Defiance, which is what you want to see in a subclass. You should see your subclass modifying your base class or interacting in some way with your base class defining features. So that's what we're going to turn Disruption into. We're going to turn it into something that modifies Defiance. And the specific modification is it gives you a second kind of mark you can make. This mark reduces damage. The other mark makes it harder to hit. So you now have choices when you're marking a creature. Do you want to make it so it's harder for them to hit, thus giving them an incentive to attack you? Or do you want to make it so when they do hit, they're going to do less damage? And again, there are certain situations where reducing a damage roll by 1d6 is going to be next to useless, but reducing 3 or 4 attacks by 1d6 or 2d6 is going to be massive. So, giving you the choice between using a disruption mark and using just a regular mama mark gives you options. It gives you choices. There's really never going to be a situation where one mark is always going to be better than the other. The way combat is set up, the allies you have on the field, the things that you're doing, the creatures that you're fighting are all going to change whether or not this is good. We talked before in the other Veva video about disruption. It has 2 different things. One, you can use it to encourage people to attack you. You know, if you attack someone else, you're going to have disadvantage, so attack me. That's what most people think of when they think of ability like that. But the other way you can do it is you can bop them and run away, and then if they can't get to you, there's no choice in this. They have to make their attack against someone else, and it's going to be at disadvantage. So there's 2 different ways to do that, and now that you have another mark, you can really kind of start deciding, okay, is this the kind of mark where I want to mark them and do less damage? Is this the kind of mark where I want to make it harder for them to hit? A lot of times, if it's going to be one really big attack, harder to hit's a lot better than doing less damage. If it's going to be a lot of little attacks, less damage, a lot better than harder to hit. So again, it gives choices. It doesn't give a right answer in any situation. Yeah. So going to 6th level with Storm's Past, our path. It felt weird that Storm's Path, which describes movement effectively, a path is something that you walk down, doesn't have anything to do with movement. So I kind of modified Storm's Path to be a movement-based ability that's also going to work in tandem with Defiance. So we're going to change Storm's Path, the text, to: while in Defiance, you can use an action to move up to your speed and move through enemy spaces. When you move through an enemy space during this movement, you mark the target. You can use this ability a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus. You regain all uses when you finish a long rest. So we've changed. First of all, Storm's Path is not once per Defiance. It's now you have a number of uses, up to 6 by maximum time. The other thing is Storm's Path effectively allows you to mark basically as many creatures as you can walk through, walk through in a turn. So normally, once you get extra attack, you can mark 2 targets in a turn, which is very useful. With Storm's Path, if you've got 30 feet of movement and you've got people close enough that you can walk through most of them without having to walk through empty space, you can mark up to 6 targets if they're all right next to each other. Because people generally don't do that, you're probably going to be marking between 3 and 4 targets with Storm's Path. But again, there's a lot of uses to that. Again, you can go with the idea, because it's a movement ability, you can mark something and then get the hell away from them so that they're just going to be having to roll disadvantage, which is especially useful if you're dealing with something like a creature that has the sneak attack ability. There are a few creatures that have it. You don't get a sneak attack if you have disadvantage on the attack. So simply running through the enemy rogue and marking them and then getting far enough away that they can't attack you means you've just taken away their best ability. So yeah, it combines extra movement. It does sacrifice 2 attacks to do it. But again, because this character is not really built to do a ton of damage, it's built to mark and take damage. It's not quite as bad as the previous version, where it was designed to just keep doing tons and tons and tons of damage. And again, if you're, Beast of Defiance and you're Sword and Board and things like that, you might have an 18 or a 20 AC. meaning if they all try to attack you, a lot of them are going to miss, especially at 6th level. If you're able to get far enough away that they can't all attack you, well, you've just given them disadvantage on their attack rolls. And for creatures that have multiple attacks, this can be a really, really useful thing. I do want to make a couple modifications to the text here. Basically, add in so you can use an action to move up to your speed and move through enemy spaces. When you move through an enemy space during this movement, you mark the target. This movement does not I can't think of the word. Provoke opportunity attacks and does not cost extra movement to move through an enemy square or enemy's space. There. So that's one thing. Generally, if you're moving through a space of like an ally, like you can move through allies. I believe, and especially if you are moving through like an enemy space or like a space of the corpse, that can be considered difficult terrain. So just to kind of make sure that that's not an argument here, it's like it doesn't cost extra things and it doesn't provoke opportunity attacks. I did kind of mull over the idea of letting this provoke opportunity attacks because, again, provoking opportunity attacks intentionally can be a really useful thing. But this ability, it makes more sense for you to not provoke opportunity attacks. If you want to actually provoke them, you can storms pass through them and then just run past them to get the opportunity attacks. But for this, it just didn't make sense for that. So that's the only modification I need to make right now that I was thinking about it. But yeah, so again, interesting ability, gives you extra movement. You have to sacrifice some attacks to do it, but you get to mark. And it also has to be these marks fade at the start of your next turn. Okay, these marks fade at the start of your next turn. Okay, so that's the ability there. For Voice of the Beast, don't change anything. Like I said, the only thing I would change is remove. You can do this once. So I should put that in there. Because there's no reason to have it in there. Since it's already explained earlier, and it adds confusion. So yeah, other than that, like I said, it's a cool ability. Finally, for Inner Beast, change the text to while in Defiance. I need to keep my syntax the same. While in Defiance, when you hit with a melee weapon attack, you can choose to unleash the Beast of Defiance with that blow. You do an additional 2d8 plus 6 force damage on that attack and recover hit point equal to the amount of force damage dealt. Defiance ends immediately after using this feature. So I made some changes to this. First things first, it's no longer an action. It's something that you can declare when you make a hit. And I did that for a couple of reasons. First things first, 2d8 plus 6 hit points is not enough to justify losing both of your attacks, which instead of doing extra damage for this one for the revised version, that means losing the ability to mark 2 different targets if you so desire. It's just not worth it for just a greater potion of healing, kind of. Yeah, I changed that, and this also means you can kind of use it in the same way that Paladin Smite, where if you roll a crit, you can go, oh, I'm using Inner Beast. And then you get to double the amount of force damage that you do. And you get to double the amount of hit points you recover. It still ends your Defiance. because I like that. I like that, you know, this is a way to basically use charges of Defiance. But yeah, I think in this way it'll get a lot more use. It's still limited because it's going to turn off your Defiance. But it actually has more usefulness than it normally would, and really gives kind of an interesting idea on how to use it. So, yeah, that is my suggestions for kind of making this work a little bit better. Otherwise, that is going to be all for me. As always, if you'd enjoyed this, like, subscribe, turn notifications on in the comments down below. What do you guys think about just the mark ability? Again, I mentioned it was a core feature in 4th edition D&D, and I thought it was super cool. And then when it didn't come back in 5th edition, except for a couple kind of strange abilities and I think 1 or 2 spells that have a similar effect, I was kind of upset because I thought it was a really cool ability. So what do you guys think? Do you think marking should be something that shows up again in D&D? Maybe, you know, based around a certain class that uses the mechanic like this, or should it become a core feature of D&D again, or are you kind of happy without having an ability that kind of feels like a taunt from a video game? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, that's all for me today, and I'll see you guys next time. All right, bye bye.